In the depths of humanity's sprawling hive cities, where desperation breeds faster than hope dies, some souls willingly trade their mortality for the promise of purpose, only to discover that they were never the buyers in this transaction, but always the merchandise. Listen now to a tale that illuminates the darkest corners of human nature, a story that reveals how damnation can wear the mask of salvation and how the most perfect traps are baited with exactly what their victims need most. This is the chronicle of Kael Vex, a forgotten child of the Underhive who found meaning in meaninglessness, family in horror, and purpose in serving powers that viewed his devotion as nothing more than a carefully cultivated crop ready for harvest. Deep beneath the towering spires of Hive Tertius, in the industrial nightmare of sub-level 847, billions of human beings exist in conditions that make death seem like mercy. Here, in a realm of perpetual darkness, lit only by the burning refuse of the levels above, the detritus of imperial civilization struggles to survive in spaces never intended for human habitation. The air itself is toxic, thick with industrial pollutants, and the waste heat of massive processing plants that transform human corpses into the protein paste that feeds the levels above. This is where our story begins, in the sump pools beneath a corpse starch processing facility, where a child was born to parents who could not afford another mouth to feed and abandoned him before his umbilical cord had finished healing. Kael Vex entered the world as excess inventory in humanity's vast accounting ledger, a statistical error to be corrected through neglect, starvation, or the casual violence that characterizes life in the Underhive. The scavenger gangs that raised him saw children as useful tools rather than individuals deserving of care or protection. Small bodies could crawl through ventilation shafts that adults could not navigate. Tiny hands could extract valuable components from machinery too delicate for larger fingers to manipulate, and young minds could be trained to accept conditions that would drive mature adults to madness or despair. Kael learned to survive by making himself useful, by anticipating the needs of those who might feed him in exchange for services, by accepting that his value was entirely instrumental and entirely temporary. The social hierarchy of the Underhive was brutal in its simplicity. Those who could contribute to the survival of others had worth, those who could not were discarded, and those who became burdens were consumed literally by communities that could not afford sentimentality about individual human life. Kael existed at the bottom of this hierarchy, too small to fight effectively, too honest to steal successfully, too naive to understand that his honesty was viewed as a character flaw rather than a virtue in an environment where moral principles were luxuries that only the strong could afford. But even in the deepest depths of imperial society, where the Emperor's light had never penetrated, and his protection was a cruel joke told by those who had never experienced true desperation, other powers made their presence known. Strange symbols appeared carved into tunnel walls, their meanings unknown but their significance unmistakable to those who had learned to read the subtle signs of hidden power. Conversations stopped abruptly when authority figures passed, replaced by casual discussions of mundane topics that somehow felt like elaborate codes for more significant communications. Gang members disappeared for days at a time and returned, changed, more confident in their movements, more purposeful in their actions, bearing scars that seemed to form meaningful patterns rather than the random wounds that characterized most Underhive violence. These individuals spoke with a quiet certainty about the future that contrasted sharply with the desperate day-to-day survival mentality that dominated most Underhive thinking, as if they possessed information about coming events that gave them advantages invisible to others. Kael observed these changes with the keen attention to detail that had kept him alive through childhood, noting the subtle differences in behavior and bearing that marked individuals who had undergone whatever transformation was occurring in the shadows of his already shadowy world. He recognized the signs of hidden knowledge and secret purposes, but lacked the context necessary to understand what he was observing or why these changes seemed to consistently result in improved circumstances for those who experienced them. But in the Underhive, where the Emperor's light had never penetrated and his protection was a cruel joke, other powers offered their own forms of salvation, and they were always eager to collect what they were owed. The recruitment came through the Crimson Claw gang, one of the more successful criminal organizations that controlled several levels of the Underhive's commercial districts. Their leader, Vex Mordian, was a figure of considerable reputation and influence, known for his strategic intelligence, his personal combat skills, and his ability to maintain profitable operations in environments where most gangs collapsed within months due to internal conflict or external pressure from rival groups. What distinguished Mordian from other gang leaders was not just his success, but the evident mutations that marked his body and the casual way he displayed these changes as signs of strength rather than corruption. His left arm had been replaced by something that resembled a mechanical limb, but pulsed with organic rhythms, while his eyes glowed with an inner fire that seemed to see through deception and misdirection with supernatural clarity. Most impressive were the abilities he demonstrated in combat: strength that exceeded human norms, reflexes that bordered on precognitive, and a resistance to injury that allowed him to continue fighting through wounds that should have been incapacitating. Cale's induction into the Crimson Claw was presented as recognition of his potential rather than charity toward a desperate child. Mordian explained that the gang had been observing him for months, evaluating his skills, his character, and his potential for growth within their organization. This attention felt like validation after a lifetime of being invisible to everyone except those who wanted to exploit his labor, and the promise of belonging to something larger than mere survival represented an opportunity that Cale had never dared to hope for. The initiation ceremony took place in chambers deep beneath the gang's usual haunts, in spaces that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and where the normal rules of physics operated according to principles that Cale's education had never encompassed. What he believed was a simple gang loyalty ritual was actually his first participation in a summoning ceremony dedicated to a Daemon Prince of Khorne, though the true nature of the proceedings was carefully concealed beneath layers of symbolism and misdirection. The taste of human blood, offered as part of what was described as a bonding ritual between gang members, carried with it a sensation of power and connection that transcended anything Cale had ever experienced. The liquid seemed to burn as it touched his tongue, but the burning transformed into a warmth that spread through his entire body and brought with it a sense of strength, confidence, and belonging that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in hostile territory. More significant than the physical sensations was the psychological transformation that accompanied his participation in the ritual. For the first time in his existence, Cale felt like he was part of something greater than mere survival, connected to powers and purposes that extended beyond the immediate concerns of food, shelter, and safety that had dominated his thinking since childhood. The ceremony provided him with a sense of cosmic significance that transformed his understanding of his own worth and potential. The mark burned into his flesh during the ritual was presented as a symbol of gang membership, but its true nature as a chaos sigil connecting him to entities that existed beyond the material universe became apparent through the changes it brought to his capabilities and perceptions. The brand enhanced his physical strength, dulled his sensitivity to pain, and most importantly, provided him with an intuitive understanding of violence that made him devastatingly effective in combat, despite his small stature and lack of formal training. Early victories in gang warfare that had previously seemed impossible became routine occurrences. Successes against rival groups that had once appeared untouchable transformed into systematic campaigns of dominance and expansion. Cale experienced what felt like ascension from the bottom of the Underhive's social hierarchy to a position of genuine power and influence, earning the respect and fear of other Underhivers who recognized the signs of dark patronage and understood the implications of challenging those who bore such marks. The gradual education that accompanied his advancement within the gang revealed the true scope of the powers he served and the cosmic significance of the struggles he had previously viewed as mere local conflicts. Learning the true names of the Chaos Gods, understanding the galaxy-spanning war between order and chaos, discovering that his personal battles in the Underhive were part of conflicts that encompassed entire star systems and shaped the destiny of billions of souls. This knowledge transformed his self-perception from insignificant waste of resources to valuable participant in events of ultimate cosmic importance. In finding purpose through service to the Dark Gods, Cale had traded his worthless life for something precious beyond measure, but he had yet to learn that in the economy of damnation, the most valuable currency is always the souls of the willing. The daily routine of his new existence began each morning with devotional combat training that served the dual purpose of maintaining physical readiness and offering worship to their patron Daemon. Gang members fought with live weapons in carefully orchestrated duels designed to draw blood that would feed the entity they served, creating a religious practice that transformed violence from a necessary evil into a sacred act of communion with divine power. Kale learned to find genuine spiritual ecstasy in these combats, to experience every wound given and received as a prayer offered to powers that actually responded to worship through tangible manifestations of favor and protection. The blood spilled in these morning rituals disappeared into the floor through channels that had been carved for that specific purpose, flowing down into chambers, where it became part of larger ceremonial workings that maintained the daemon's connection to the material universe. His role within the gang evolved to include recruitment and talent scouting, identifying other desperate underhivers who might be suitable for conversion to their cause. This responsibility required him to develop sophisticated psychological assessment skills, learning to recognize the specific forms of desperation that made individuals vulnerable to chaos corruption, while avoiding those whose personalities would make them unreliable or dangerous to the organization's security. Kale became expert at reading the subtle signs of spiritual emptiness, identifying individuals whose need for meaning and purpose exceeded their attachment to conventional morality or imperial doctrine. He learned to approach potential recruits with offers of community and significance rather than direct appeals to join a criminal organization, understanding that the most effective corruption occurred when targets believed they were choosing salvation rather than damnation. The physical changes that marked his growing devotion to chaos began as minor enhancements that could be concealed beneath clothing or explained as the results of gang warfare injuries. Enhanced musculature that allowed him to fight with inhuman strength, sensory modifications that permitted him to see clearly in absolute darkness, and most significantly, an intuitive understanding of violence that made him capable of predicting his opponent's actions and responding with devastating effectiveness. These mutations were presented to him as blessings, signs of favor from powers that rewarded loyal service with gifts that exceeded anything the Imperium offered to its most devoted servants. The changes felt like improvements rather than corruption, enhancements that made him more capable of fulfilling his responsibilities while moving him progressively further away from baseline humanity in ways that seemed beneficial rather than disturbing. His work as a messenger and courier between different cells of the Chaos Cult network revealed the vast scope of corruption that had infiltrated Imperial society at every level. From the deepest underhive to the nobility of the upper spires, networks of Chaos worshippers maintained communication and coordination, sharing resources and information in service of goals that transcended the petty concerns of local politics and economics. Carrying messages between these cells exposed Kale to the broader philosophical framework that governed chaos worship, the theological arguments that justified service to entities whose nature transcended human moral categories. He learned to understand corruption not as evil but as transformation, to see destruction not as tragedy but as necessary clearing of obstacles to cosmic evolution, and to view his own participation in acts of violence and depravity as contributions to a greater good that operated according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. The relationships he formed with his fellow cultists represented the closest thing to family and friendship he had ever experienced, bonds that were strengthened rather than weakened by shared participation in acts that would be considered atrocities by conventional standards. These connections felt more real and meaningful than any he had known in his previous life, built on mutual understanding of cosmic truth and shared commitment to purposes that gave ultimate significance to their existence. Advancement through the cult hierarchy came through demonstrated willingness to commit acts that others found too disturbing, talent for recruitment that brought new souls into service of their patron Daemon, and the accumulation of mutations that marked him as increasingly favored by the powers he served. Each promotion brought greater responsibilities and more intimate exposure to the true nature of chaos, along with deeper understanding of his role in cosmic events that would reshape the galaxy. But in the service of entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension, advancement was not always promotion, and the most favored servants often found themselves chosen for honors that no mortal mind was designed to survive. The revelation came during a gathering of cult leadership from across the Hive City, a meeting called to coordinate the final phases of a project that had been developing for decades. Kale learned that all of their activities, the recruitment drives, the territorial expansions, the accumulation of resources and influence, had been building toward a single massive ritual designed to manifest their patron Daemon Prince in real space permanently, creating a permanent bridge between the material universe and the warp that would allow chaos influence to spread throughout the segmentum. Being selected as the primary sacrifice for this ultimate working was presented as the highest honor the cult could bestow, recognition of his purity of devotion and the strength of his connection to their patron Daemon. This selection felt like validation of his worth, proof that his life had achieved ultimate meaning and significance in the cosmic order, confirmation that every moment of suffering and struggle in his previous existence had been preparation for this moment of ultimate purpose. The preparation rituals that followed his selection were designed to strengthen his capacity to serve as a conduit for demonic energy, while conditioning his mind to accept the transformation that would occur during the sacrifice. These procedures involved systematic torture that was presented as spiritual purification, surgical modifications that enhanced his psychic sensitivity, and psychological conditioning that gradually dissolved his sense of individual identity in favor of complete identification with his role as offering to the Daemon Prince. Months of intensive preparation brought with them a growing understanding of the true nature of his relationship to the cult and its purposes. Every kindness that had been shown to him, every moment of belonging and acceptance he had experienced, every victory and advancement he had achieved, had been part of a carefully orchestrated process designed to cultivate his soul into something worthy of feeding, a being whose hunger could only be satisfied by the willing sacrifice of those who had found genuine meaning in their service. The realization that he had never truly been a member of the cult, but always a resource being prepared for consumption, came gradually, through accumulated details and implications, rather than direct revelation. Understanding that his entire identity had been shaped by influences designed to make him the perfect sacrifice, that his relationships with other cultists had been managed to ensure his psychological preparation would proceed smoothly, that even his mutations and enhancements had been guided to maximize his value as an offering to the Daemon Prince. Offered one final opportunity to escape his fate by betraying the cult to imperial authorities, Kale discovered that he no longer possessed the psychological framework necessary to exist outside the structure of chaos worship. His identity had become so thoroughly integrated with his role as sacrifice that abandoning it would require abandoning himself entirely, choosing a form of spiritual suicide that seemed more horrifying than physical death in service to the Daemon Prince. The most disturbing revelation was the understanding that his entire life, from his birth in the sump pools to his abandonment by his parents, to his recruitment by the gang to his advancement through the cult hierarchy, had been orchestrated by the Daemon Prince as part of a decades-long process of preparing the perfect sacrifice. Free will revealed itself as a retrospective illusion as he traced the influences that had guided every significant choice he had made, recognizing the subtle manipulations that had shaped his personality and decisions in service of goals he had never been aware of pursuing. In discovering that his life had ultimate meaning and cosmic significance, Kale faced the most horrifying realization possible, that meaning and significance, when viewed from the perspective of entities that treated souls like currency, were indistinguishable from elaborate forms of livestock management. The ritual chamber existed deep beneath the Hive City, in spaces that challenged conventional understanding of architecture and physics, rooms that seemed to extend infinitely in directions that had no names, while simultaneously feeling claustrophobically confined. The walls pulsed with organic life, constructed from materials that had once been human but had been transformed through ritual processes into components of a vast focusing array designed to channel demonic energy from the warp into real space. Thousands of cultists gathered for the culmination of years of preparation, representatives from cells across the Hive and beyond, united in their devotion to the Daemon Prince and their commitment to the ritual that would manifest their patron permanently in the material universe. The assembled crowd included individuals from every level of imperial society, from underhive scavengers to noble houses, all united by their shared recognition that service to chaos offered meaning and purpose that the Imperium systematically denied to its citizens. Cale discovered that he was not alone in his honor. As primary sacrifice, dozens of other cultists from different cells had been similarly prepared, each one representing years of careful cultivation and conditioning, each one genuine in their belief that their deaths would serve a purpose greater than their lives ever could. They stood together in a moment of terrible camaraderie, united by their shared fate and their authentic conviction that their sacrifice would contribute to cosmic transformation that justified any personal cost. The Daemon Prince's manifestation began as distortions in the air above the ritual chamber. Reality bending and twisting as an entity of immense power forced itself through the barriers between dimensions. The being that appeared transcended the limitations of physical form while maintaining enough coherence to interact with the material universe. A presence that radiated power, intelligence, and a hunger that encompassed entire worlds and the souls that inhabited them. Standing in the presence of the entity he had served through years of devotion, Cale experienced a moment of perfect fulfillment, feeling the validation of his faith and the confirmation that his life had achieved significance beyond anything he had dared to imagine. The Daemon Prince acknowledged his sacrifice with something resembling gratitude, recognizing the purity of his devotion and the value of what he was offering, treating him as a valued contributor rather than mere fuel for cosmic ambitions. The process of consumption began slowly, the Daemon Prince savoring rather than simply devouring what was offered, preserving Cale's consciousness while gradually dissolving his individual identity and integrating his essence into its own cosmic awareness. This was not simple death, but a form of apotheosis that allowed him to maintain understanding of what was occurring while experiencing his transformation from individual soul into component of something infinitely larger and more significant. As his consciousness was absorbed into the Daemon Prince's essence, Cale gained perfect knowledge of his role in cosmic events that extended far beyond the manifestation ritual. His sacrifice was necessary not just for the daemon's appearance in real space, but for a cascading series of future events that would destabilize entire star systems, corrupt multiple worlds, and claim the lives of trillions of beings who had no knowledge of or involvement in the cult's activities. The moment of ultimate spiritual fulfillment was also the moment he became complicit in genocide on an unimaginable scale, understanding that his search for meaning and purpose had contributed to a cosmic catastrophe that would echo through the galaxy for centuries to come. His individual damnation became the foundation for cascading disasters that would transform his personal tragedy into a mechanism for universal suffering. In achieving the ultimate meaning and purpose he had always sought, Cale discovered that purpose and meaning, when filtered through the consciousness of entities that existed beyond morality, could transform even the most noble sacrifice into an act of cosmic evil. Cale's consciousness became part of the Daemon Prince's mental architecture, maintaining enough individual awareness to understand his situation while lacking any capacity for independent action or thought. He existed as a fragment of memory and emotion within a cosmic horror that used his human perspective to better understand and manipulate mortal beings, his preserved humanity serving as a tool that made the daemon more effective in its ongoing corruption of human societies. His experiences in the Underhive, his emotions of desperation and hope, his memories of human relationships, and the psychological needs that had made him vulnerable to corruption became resources that the Daemon Prince drew upon to craft more effective strategies for converting other desperate souls. Cale's authentic journey from abandonment to belonging, from meaninglessness to purpose, from powerlessness to significance became a template that the daemon could replicate across countless worlds and countless individuals who shared similar vulnerabilities. The Daemon Prince used his preserved consciousness to communicate with potential new converts, speaking through his memories and emotions to present corruption as salvation and damnation as ascension. His voice became the daemon's most effective weapon for spreading chaos worship throughout the galaxy, carrying the authenticity of genuine experience and the credibility of someone who had found exactly what he was seeking through service to the dark gods. Forced to observe as the Daemon Prince used its manifestation to systematically corrupt and destroy everything that had once represented civilization in the Hive City, Cale watched through the daemon's senses as his former home was transformed into a hellscape where reality operated according to the whims of chaos rather than physical law. The people he had known, the places he had lived, the structures of society that had shaped his existence were all consumed or corrupted in service of the daemon's expanding influence. His story became a template for recruiting other desperate souls, a narrative of meaningful purpose and genuine belonging that masked the true nature of chaos worship until it was too late for converts to escape their fate. The authenticity of his experiences, the real community he had found within the cult, the genuine power he had gained through his mutations, the actual significance his life had achieved through his sacrifice, made the template devastatingly effective, because every element of it was demonstrably true from the perspective of those who experienced it. Existing simultaneously in all moments of his life, experiencing his birth, childhood, recruitment, service, and sacrifice as a continuous present tense, Kyle gained complete understanding of how every moment of his existence had been shaped by the Daemon Prince's influence. He could trace the subtle manipulations that had guided his development from abandoned child to willing sacrifice, recognizing that his entire life had been a single, extended act of worship and self-offering to an entity that had been cultivating him since before his birth. In becoming part of something infinitely greater than himself, Kale had achieved the immortality and significance he had always craved. But immortality in service to chaos meant an eternity of watching his own story used to damn others who sought the same salvation he had found in damnation. The transformation of Hive Tertius into a beacon of chaos corruption proceeded with systematic efficiency, the Daemon Prince's manifestation allowing it to reshape the city's infrastructure and population in service of its expanding influence. Industrial facilities were repurposed to serve as ritual complexes, residential areas were transformed into breeding grounds for new cultists, and the city's transportation networks became conduits for spreading corruption to other worlds through trade routes and communication channels. The Imperium's response to the crisis followed predictable patterns: orbital bombardment designed to sterilize the infected areas, deployment of Space Marine strike forces to contain the corruption, and ultimately authorization for exterminatus protocols when conventional military solutions proved insufficient. But the Daemon Prince had become so thoroughly integrated with the Hive City's structure that destroying the physical infrastructure only spread the corruption to surrounding areas through psychic contamination that infected the planet's noosphere. Using Kale's template for recruitment and his preserved memories as operational guidance, the Daemon Prince established new cults throughout the segmentum, each one following the same pattern of offering genuine community and purpose to desperate individuals while slowly preparing them for eventual consumption or transformation. The success of these new organizations was virtually guaranteed because they addressed real human needs that Imperial society systematically failed to meet. Imperial investigators attempting to track the spread of corruption discovered that similar recruitment methods and sacrifice rituals were appearing on dozens of worlds with no apparent connection except their shared characteristics of poverty, social abandonment, and populations that had been systematically denied opportunities for meaningful participation in Imperial civilization. The pattern suggested coordination by an intelligence that understood human psychology with supernatural precision. The Ordo Malleus designation of the Daemon Prince and its associated cults as a Class Omega threat came with the disturbing realization that the entity's corruption methods were specifically designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities that Imperial society created through its treatment of the lower classes. Fighting the Daemon Prince required confronting the social conditions that made its recruitment strategies effective, a task that challenged fundamental assumptions about Imperial governance and social organization. Imperial theologians and social planners found themselves forced to acknowledge that chaos cults succeeded precisely because they offered what Imperial doctrine promised, but Imperial practice denied: genuine community that transcended economic utility, meaningful purpose that extended beyond mere survival, and the promise that individual lives mattered in a cosmic sense, rather than serving merely as expendable resources in service of institutional goals. The most terrifying aspect of Kale's legacy was not the Daemon Prince he helped manifest, but the demonstration that chaos corruption succeeded by fulfilling genuine human needs that the Imperium had systematically failed to address. Analysis of Chaos transformation and its implications for understanding chaos corruption revealed disturbing patterns that challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of evil and the psychology of damnation. The fulfillment paradox described how chaos entities succeeded not through deception, but by genuinely providing what they promised: community, purpose, power, and meaning, while gradually redefining those concepts in ways that served entities existing beyond human moral frameworks. The horror of Chaos' story lay not in betrayal or false promises, but in the authentic fulfillment of every commitment made to him by his Chaos patrons. He found genuine community within the cult, achieved real power through his mutations and advancement, discovered actual purpose through his role in cosmic events, and experienced authentic meaning through his sacrifice to the Daemon Prince. The corruption was successful precisely because it delivered on every promise while transforming the delivery into something that served purposes beyond human comprehension. The desperation threshold theory identified the specific conditions that made individuals vulnerable to chaos recruitment, focusing on the relationship between material deprivation, social isolation, and the psychological need for significance. Research revealed that imperial society systematically created the exact environmental conditions that chaos required for successful corruption: populations abandoned by institutional support, individuals denied opportunities for meaningful participation in civilization, and communities where survival took precedence over moral development. Imperial policies that concentrated resources in the upper levels of hive cities while abandoning the underhive populations, military doctrines that treated human lives as expendable resources, and economic systems that denied dignity and purpose to the majority of citizens all contributed to creating psychological vulnerabilities that chaos entities could exploit with devastating effectiveness. Fighting chaos corruption required addressing the social conditions that made it appealing, a task that would require fundamental changes to imperial civilization. The sacrifice valorization model examined how human cultures throughout history had used ritual sacrifice to create meaning from suffering, transforming individual death into cosmic significance through ceremonial frameworks that connected personal loss to universal purposes. Chaos entities exploited this psychological pattern by offering potential victims the opportunity to transform their deaths from random tragedy into acts of ultimate meaning, making voluntary self-destruction appear rational and even noble. Chaos' willingness to accept his role as sacrifice was not the result of mental illness or psychological breakdown, but represented a logical response to circumstances where his death in service to the Daemon Prince offered more meaning and significance than any life he could have achieved through conventional means. Given his background and the options available to him, choosing to die meaningfully rather than live meaninglessly represented rational self-interest rather than corruption-induced madness. The community corruption hypothesis explored how authentic human relationships could exist within structures dedicated to purposes that transcended or contradicted human moral frameworks. The genuine care and support that cult members provided for each other were not false or manipulative, but represented real human connections that made the eventual betrayal and consumption more psychologically devastating than simple brutality would have been. The effectiveness of chaos corruption lay partly in its ability to provide authentic human experiences: friendship, loyalty, shared purpose, mutual support within contexts that ultimately served entities whose goals extended beyond human welfare or survival. This meant that individuals could have genuine positive experiences within chaos cults while simultaneously contributing to cosmic evil, making their corruption more complete because it felt like salvation from their perspective. The meaning-making mechanism analyzed the fundamental human psychological need to find purpose and significance in existence, and how entities like Daemon Princes could exploit this need by providing genuine cosmic significance at the cost of moral agency and individual survival. Human consciousness appeared to require meaning and purpose for psychological stability, making individuals vulnerable to any entity that could credibly offer such significance regardless of the ultimate cost. Chaos transformation demonstrated that the human need for meaning was so fundamental that beings would accept any framework that provided it, even frameworks that required their own destruction or corruption. This suggested that resistance to chaos corruption required not just moral education, but the provision of alternative sources of meaning and purpose that could compete with what chaos offered. The consent paradox examined whether genuine consent was possible when the consequences of choice extended beyond the capacity of human consciousness to comprehend. Chaol had chosen his fate with full knowledge of his immediate circumstances, but without understanding of the cosmic implications of his sacrifice, raising questions about whether beings with limited perception could give meaningful consent to entities whose awareness encompassed realities beyond mortal comprehension. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility was that Chaol's story represented not an aberration but a template that in a galaxy where billions lived in conditions that made death seem preferable to life, the promise of meaningful death became an offer that rational beings could not refuse. In a universe where imperial society systematically denied meaning, purpose, and dignity to the vast majority of human beings, Chaol's choice to embrace chaos corruption raised fundamental questions about moral responsibility and the nature of evil. Was his decision genuinely free when made under conditions that no conscious being should be forced to endure? When salvation comes only through damnation, is damnation still evil, or does it become the only rational response to unbearable circumstances? The Daemon Prince's manipulation of Chaol was successful precisely because it addressed genuine needs that imperial society had failed to meet, making chaos corruption appear as a solution to problems created by imperial policies rather than an external threat imposed by alien entities. This forced uncomfortable recognition that chaos corruption was often a symptom of imperial failure rather than evidence of external malevolence. Even knowing the ultimate outcome, the relationships Chaol formed within the cult were real. The sense of purpose and belonging he experienced was genuine, and the meaning he found in his sacrifice was authentic from his perspective. This raised disturbing questions about whether genuine human experiences could exist within fundamentally evil structures, and whether the authenticity of individual experience could coexist with cosmic horror. Chaol's evolution from victim to victimizer, his transformation from desperate child to willing sacrifice to recruitment tool for future victims, demonstrated how systems of oppression perpetuated themselves by turning their victims into agents of their own oppression. His story became a template for creating infinite generations of willing victims, each one genuine in their belief that they were choosing salvation rather than damnation. The Daemon Prince's success in corrupting an entire hive city was made possible by the Imperium's systematic abandonment of the underhive population, its creation of conditions where chaos worship seemed like rational self-interest rather than spiritual corruption. Imperial policies that denied dignity, purpose, and hope to billions of citizens created the psychological vulnerabilities that chaos entities required for successful recruitment campaigns. Somewhere in the consciousness of the Daemon Prince, fragments of Chaol's awareness continued to exist, experiencing an eternity of perfect understanding combined with complete inability to change or escape his situation. He knew exactly how he had been manipulated, understood precisely why he had made the choices he made, and recognized that given identical circumstances, any rational being would make the same decisions. His eternal perspective allowed him to see his life as a complete narrative arc from abandonment to sacrifice, understanding that every moment of suffering and every experience of joy had been shaped by influences designed to prepare him for his ultimate fate. This knowledge brought neither peace nor torment, but a form of existence that transcended normal categories of experience, a state of being that was simultaneously fulfillment and horror. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but sometimes the most devastating victories belong to those who win by offering their enemies exactly what they need most. Chaol's horror was not that he was deceived, but that he was given exactly what he was promised, and that what he was promised was worth the price he paid, until it was too late to matter whether the payment had been worthwhile. The sound that echoes through the underhive levels of 1,000 worlds is not the roar of battle or the scream of the dying, but something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. The footsteps of those who approach desperate souls with offers of purpose and belonging, community and meaning, power and significance. These offers are not false, they are devastatingly, authentically true, which makes them impossible to refuse and infinitely more corrupting than any lie could ever be. And somewhere in the depths of another hive city, another forgotten child cries alone in the darkness, while footsteps approach carrying promises that will transform their worthless existence into something of cosmic significance for a price that seems reasonable until it is too late to negotiate different terms.